Now, the English Civil War. What the fuck was it all about? Well, in order to start talking about the English Civil War, it's necessary to recap some of the things that happened in the last episode with King James the first slash sixth. Now, King James was King of Scotland, and he was now King of England as well. Also, you remember the problems with the Reformation and with the Catholics and the Protestants and all that stuff. Now, all this is very important. Another thing has been developing in the background, and that thing that has been developing has been the economic change and some of the social change in general in society. So basically, some people have started to be very successful in business, and a new class has started to become more prominent, and that class is the middle class. The middle class being people with wealth and money, but who aren't from aristocratic families. And many of these people are interested in politics and want to influence the politics and government through being represented or being representatives in the parliament. Now, if you remember from the Magna Carta that the powerful people had pretty much written a document and made the king sign it. Well, after that, there had been some development of a parliament, and this parliament had grown gradually and become more and more influential gradually over the centuries. And at the time of the Stuarts, this parliament was getting quite ambitious, and they really wanted to increase their powers now, and they wanted to be more more of a body that represents the people and that can demand changes and that can influence the king and tell the king what to do almost, rather than be just there to do what the king says. So these fuckers in Parliament also now many of them are also Protestants, mostly Protestants, and not Catholics, and many of them are not Church of England, but are in fact non-conformists, which means that they are members of religious groups that are not the Church of England, but are other versions of Protestantism. Many of them are called Puritans. Their religious views are more extreme Protestant than those of the Church of England, and they think that the Church of England is a bit too similar to the Catholic Church, and they want it to be more like Lutheran or one of the other European Protestant faiths. So these guys in Parliament are going to start being a problem for the king. And the people who they represent, the Puritans, the business people, the anti-Catholics, and the parliamentarians and the anti-monarchists, this is going to lead to war. So why does the king have a parliament anyway? What does he use the parliament for? What's the point? Well, he gets the parliament together and he gets them to agree to stuff so that it looks like people agree with what he's doing. And he also uses them to get money, because they agree to taxes, and then they make sure that those taxes are raised by the people. Now, King James didn't like the Parliament. He thought they were a bunch of tossers, and he basically told them to go fuck themselves, and said that he was the fucking man in charge, and the king could do whatever the fuck he wanted. And part of the reason for this was that the Parliament in England was a bit more of a formidable force than any that had existed in Scotland before. Scottish kings in history had not been quite as bad as the English ones, and there wasn't the same history as the Magna Carta and all that stuff in Scotland. Anyway, and James was a bit of a cunt anyway, as you remember. So when James died, Charles I was the new king. Charles was married to this fucking French princess called Henrietta Maria, and she was a Catholic. And with her, he had several children. Now, those children were actually raised to be Catholic, but this was kept secret because many people in England hated Catholics and were really violently anti-Catholic, and the Catholics had been treated like shit and were being treated like shit in England at this time. And Charles was more sympathetic to Catholics than his father had been, because his father, James, really fucking didn't like Catholics. And then the Catholics tried to fucking kill him, so that he really didn't like the cunts. Charles, being married to a Catholic, meant that he got a lot of shit from people who hated Catholics. And these Puritans, they really didn't fucking like Charles, and they were very fucking skeptical, and they had these sort of fucking conspiracy theories, these paranoid theories that Charles was a Catholic and that he wanted to bring back the Catholic Church in England and start killing Protestants again and stuff like that. And they thought that he was trying to change the Church of England into being Catholic again. And they really didn't like him. And they kept saying all this shit about the king, that he was a cunt and that he was a Catholic and stuff like that. And elsewhere in Europe, Protestantism was sometimes aligned with developments in parliamentarianism and the absolute monarchies and kings in other countries, France, Spain, for example, were persecuting the Protestants. In France, those Protestants were called the Huguenots, and they were treated like shit in France. So, and also in the end of the 16th century, there had been a massive massacre in Paris where all the fucking Protestants had been killed by the French Catholics with the support of the French monarchy. So people in Britain were very, very scared of Catholics, in a similar way to how people today in many countries are scared of Muslims and are Islamophobic. You know, it was a bit like that. They thought that the Catholics were the enemy. They thought the Catholics were terrorists. They thought the Catholics would try to destroy the whole system and to force everybody into their religion. And these Puritans were the most anti-Catholic of everybody because they really fucking hated them. Now, King Charles had inherited his father's belief that he was the fucking God's chosen to be king, and that nobody could question him, and that Parliament were just a bunch of cunts. He also didn't like that they were all going around being all anti-Catholic and making a big deal out of that, and thought they were a bit of a bunch of wankers. And he also didn't want them to have any power, and he wanted them, if anything, to have less power than they had, and to all fuck off and let him be king. So the Church of England at the time that he was the boss of, the Church of England was a Protestant church, but it had some of the same ceremonies and some of the same some of the same practices as had existed with Catholicism. It wasn't as extremely different from Catholic Church as these Puritans were. And so, for example, the Puritans and the more extreme Protestants didn't like having any sort of decorations in the church. They didn't like the stained glass windows. They didn't like all the beautiful paintings. They didn't like the crucifixes and the crosses and all the beautiful religious art. They thought that was bollocks and that you should get rid of it. And they thought that the Bible told you that that's all shit and that you shouldn't have it. Whereas the Church of England had those things and the beautiful art and the nice things. And Charles and his friends wanted actually to have more of those nice things in the churches and not less of them, which really pissed off the Puritans. And you remember Charles is also King of Scotland and England, the same as his father was. Now, England and Scotland are not united together into one kingdom. They're still separate countries with their own laws and traditions, but Charles is king of both countries. So Charles is having problems with Parliament, and he gets sick of them because they won't do what he says, and he tells them all to fuck off, and he rules without a Parliament. And I think he rules for like 12 years without a Parliament, but I might be wrong. But I'll check that, fix that if I've got it wrong. Anyway, he rules without the fucking Parliament, and he thinks, well, this is all very well, this is all going good. And at the same time, his Archbishop of Canterbury is the man who's sort of in charge of the Church of England. The king is the head of it, but the bloke who actually runs it is the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the Archbishop of Canterbury is this guy called Laud. And Archbishop Laud wants to change the Church of England a little bit and make it a little bit nicer and make it more uniform so that everybody has to have the same fucking book. And he introduces this new book, and it's a new book of prayer. And they say everyone's got to read this fucking book in church. You can't be reading any other fucking book. You've got to read this book. And all Church of England churches, they've got to stick with this fucking book. And if you're non-conformist, you can go fuck yourself. And if you're a Catholic, then you shouldn't even be a Catholic, because we still hate Catholics. But everyone's got to be Church of England, and they've all got to read this fucking book. Now, in Scotland, when at the same time as England was changing its religion back in Henry VIII's time, and that back then Scotland also had a similar thing happening when they were changing their religion, and it was called the Scottish Reformation. And Scotland sort of changed its religion. Well, most Scottish people did from Catholic to Protestant, although some remained Catholic and they had a Catholic queen. But as you remember, she was sort of in the minority, and a lot of her people didn't like her because she was a Catholic, and in the end they fucking kicked her out and forced her son to be a Protestant. So anyway, the Church of Scotland, or the Scottish Church, the Protestant Church, was it's called Presbyterian. Presbyterian was the name for the Scottish Protestant faith, and it was a bit different from the English Church of England. And Charles I said, well, Scotland have got to have the same fucking stuff as England, and they've got to have this fucking book that we've just got, this new fucking book, and everyone in Scotland's got to stop reading their Presbyterian book, and they've got to read this new fucking book that we've just published. And so he had these cunts go up to Scotland and shoving this fucking book in everyone's faces and said, you've got to read this fucking book now. And the Scottish people were not happy. They said, fuck that. We've got our own book. We don't want this fucking English bullshit book. You can shove it up your fucking English arse, you cunts. And they got so fucking pissed off that they rebelled, and they created an army. And it was the army of the Covenant. And the Covenant was a promise that they made, that they weren't going to read this fucking book, and they were going to keep their own fucking books and their own traditions and their own Presbyterian ways. And anyone tried to stop them, they were going to fucking kill. And they marched down into England, and they started fucking up England and sticking two fingers up, or a middle finger, at the English. So Charles was shitting himself, and he said, fucking hell, what am I going to do about these fucking Scottish cunts? Fucking hell, if they don't want to read the book, that's one thing, but fucking taking over the fucking... It's a bit of an overreaction. Fuck's sake, it's only a fucking book like that. And so he said, I'd better get my soldiers together and raise an army to go up and fight the Scots. But the only way he could get the money was to ask Parliament to come back. And you remember that he told them to fuck off before and said he didn't need them. So they didn't really want to come back and help him, but he really needed them to. So he called them back, and they came back, and they said, what the fuck do you want, King? You told us to fuck off. And the king said, well, I need you now because there's a problem. And they went, oh, is there? Oh, I see. Oh, fucking hell. And they said, well, go fuck yourself, Charles. And Charles sent the army up to fight the Scots, and this army got fucking beaten up, and the Scottish won. And basically Charles had to go up and sort of speak to the Scottish and sort of be nice to them and ask them politely if they could just please go home, and they did. But it had cost him a lot of money, and it had cost him his army and everything. And the Parliament said to the king, look, Charles, there's going to have to be some fucking changes around here. We're not going to take this shit anymore. And from now on, there's going to be like a new Magna Carta, and it's going to be a much better one. And the Parliament's going to have rights, like you can't fucking kick us out anymore, and you need our consent, and you have to ask us for our agreement when you want to do some shit and stuff like that. And Charles really thought they were a bunch of fucking assholes. So he said, fuck them. And he got this this dude called Stafford, and he was a duke or an earl, and he liked the king, and he thought that Parliament were a bunch of wankers. And the king said to him, look, I want you to fucking go and arrest some of these cunts in the parliament, and the parliament found out about it, and they said, "Fuck that! We're going to arrest him, and we're going to cut his head off, and the king's going to have to agree with it. Otherwise, we're going to cause loads of shit and rebel against the king and fucking take over London and stuff." So the king had to actually sign to have his friend killed because the parliament wanted him dead. And then the king tried to go to parliament and arrest these people himself, and they knew he was coming, and they got those people to just fuck off. And then the king was there, and they were laughing at him, calling him a cunt and stuff. And the king was really pissed off now. So it got really bad. And then basically the parliament started raising armies and shit. And the king started raising armies and shit. And they started a war. The war was between the parliament and the king. And it wasn't like the American war with North against South. It wasn't like that. It was just people who agree with the king against people who agree with the parliament. So you could have, for example, a father fighting against his son, or a brother against a brother because of their loyalties. And most of these Puritans and these extreme Protestants were on the side of the parliament, and a lot of the big business people as well on the side of the parliament. A lot of people who didn't like Catholics on the side of the parliament, and the king had quite a lot of people supporting him as well, because they thought the king is the king, you know, you can't be fucking challenging the king because he's the fucking king. What do you want? Do you want craziness? You know. So and that some people thought that these Puritans were a bunch of fucking wankers. So anyway, there's a big war. Charles had a nephew called Rupert, who was born in Prague, and he was called Rupert of the Rhine, and he came over and became Charles's sort of commander of his army. And he kind of was a bit like Cristiano Ronaldo type. He liked showing off and stuff, and he was sort of like he'd go crazy and try to show off in battle rather than being disciplined and stuff. Anyway, the first battle they had, the king and the parliament both said they won at the end, because basically neither side actually achieved anything. They just fucking killed loads of people on each side and nothing happened. So both sides said, I won that, no, I won it. So it was a waste of fucking life, really. And then the two sides got these nicknames. So the parliament people were called the Roundheads, don't know why. And the king's people were called the Cavaliers. So when people talk about the Civil War, they talk about Roundheads and Cavaliers. Now, this war kept going back and forward 50-50, with the Parliament winning a battle and then the king winning a battle, and so on, without very much being achieved by either side. The Scottish were heavily involved in the war. I mean, they had started it, and basically some of the Scottish were supporting the king because he was King of Scotland after all, and they were loyal to him. Others, especially these Covenant people, the fuck the book guys, they joined with the Parliament side because they were pissed off about the book. And the Parliament people had said, well, we're going to have religious freedom when we take over. So, you know, anyway, this dude came along, and he was a member of Parliament, and his name was Oliver Cromwell, and he was a Puritan, and he was a right fucking cunt. But he was very good at organization and getting things done. And he started training the soldiers in new ways of fighting, trying to make them really well organized and disciplined, and so they could win the battles. And it was very successful, and he started kicking the shit out of the king's armies, and he became the leader of the entire Parliament army. And then he became the most important and most powerful man in the country, because they won the war, and they captured the king, and they put the king on trial and accused him of being a traitor to the people, and they cut his head off. And then they said, we're going to have a fucking republic now. So Charles' family had to fuck off to France, and we had the Parliament running the country. But you know, people are skeptical about politicians today. Well, Oliver Cromwell had the same opinion about the politicians then. He thought that all the members of Parliament were a bunch of corrupt, self-serving fucking cunts, and that they were shit. And he decided that they weren't good enough to run England, and that he, as leader of the army, was the best person to run England. So he made himself a dictator, and he took his soldiers into the Parliament and threw all the members out and said, fuck off. And he ruled England as Lord Protector, which is a title he chose because he didn't want to be a king, but he wanted to be a dictator. So he was Lord Protector of the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth was England, Scotland, and Ireland, and Wales. And he was the fucking dictator for 10 years, and he had only one more thing left to do after he'd done that, and that was to go and fucking kill loads of Irish people. The Irish had been on the side of the king in the war, and some of them were still holding castles and stuff. And Cromwell really fucking hated the Catholics, and he really hated the Irish. Now, the Irish were mostly Catholics, by the way. So Cromwell went there, and he started just mass murdering all the Irish and fucking killing them. Even if they surrendered, put their hands up, he'd say, right, no, I'm gonna fucking shoot you all, you're all fucking dead, I'm gonna burn your houses down, and all this. And he was so bad that people in Ireland now still talk about Cromwell as the, you know, like a Hitler type of cunt. Now Cromwell's problem was that he made it all about him. So he didn't have any friends or anybody to take over after he died. He had a son called Richard Cromwell, and Richard was supposed to take over after Cromwell died, but he took over and he didn't last 5 seconds. They called him Tumble Down Dick because he didn't last 5 fucking seconds. And as soon as Cromwell had died and Tumble Down Dick had tumbled down, the English ended up bringing back the monarchy again and getting dead Charles's son to come back and be fucking King Charles I. But that's, sorry, King Charles II. Anyway, that's for the next video. Now, what is the significance of the English Civil War, and why is it important? Well, it's very, very important because it was our revolution. The problem is it was too early. If it had been later, then we might have a more modern system. But it was a very, it was a revolution, and it was the overthrow or the overthrow of the monarchy, and we had a republic. The trouble is that it was so long ago that everyone's forgotten about it. Now, what it proved that the kings can't just be dictatorial and do what they like. The kings have to respect the rights of the people, and they have to behave moderately, or they're going to get fucking overthrown and killed. It proved that the people would not take loads of shit forever. So after the English Civil War, the future kings of England and queens behaved in a more respectable way and a more conciliatory way, and cooperated more with Parliament and agreed to give away some of their powers to Parliament and to the people's representatives, and that they agreed that it's better to give a little bit away so they could stay in power rather than anger the people and get overthrown and removed, which is what happened in other countries. So there you go, the English Civil War.